Zoom session. We will get started momentarily. Good afternoon to those of you joining us on Zoom. If you'll just give us a moment to let everybody log into the session, we'll get started momentarily. Good afternoon and welcome to today's very special event to discuss the G7 and US-EU summits. We're delighted to be partnering with the George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs for today's event and to welcome any GW students who may be joining us today. The Elliott School is also a partner with WIDA at our intensive trade seminar, which will again be virtual this fall. You can find information about that event and our event next week on US-China competitiveness issues on our website, www.wita.org. As you know, if you've watched WIDA webinars in the past, we like to say a quick hello to some of those you are in community with at today's event, even if you can't see them on Zoom. So welcome today to Nelson Cunningham with McLarty Associates, Sarah Dean with John Deere, Alice Slayton Clark at the U.S. Council for International Business, and Martin Bell at the Scotch Whisky Association. Welcome, Nelson, Sarah, Alice, and Martin. If you're watching this on Zoom, you can ask questions of our discussants using the Q&A tab on Zoom. We'll try to get to as many of those as we can toward the latter part of our event. I'd like to now introduce our event partner, Professor Michael Moore of the George Washington University Elliott School of International Affairs. Mike, thanks to you and your team at GW for your support for today's event and everything our two organizations do together. You are a wonderful partner of WIDA, and we are very grateful to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that warm welcome, and certainly the same goes for our enthusiasm about the partnership. So thanks to Ken and the WIDA team for taking the lead on this and other high-quality events at WIDA, which is really the go-to place for those interested in learning about contemporary trade policy issues. We're grateful for the opportunity to partner with WIDA on this and other important events, including a series on WTO reform that will begin this fall. So just a couple of words about GW's Institute for International Economic Policy. It's a nonpartisan research institute at George Washington University's Elliott School. We focus on critical issues affecting the global economy through research, education, and engagement with policymakers and organizations. Now, after that commercial break, on to our main event. So we are very honored to welcome two distinguished guests and one distinguished moderator for the event today. Ambassador Stavros Lambrinidis is the current ambassador of the European Union to the United States. He previously served as the European Union Special Representative for Human Rights and as the Greek Foreign Minister. More information about him and the other speakers and moderators you can find in the event email. Ambassador Karen Pierce is the British ambassador to the United States. She was previously the United Kingdom's permanent representative to the United Nations and chief operating officer of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in London. Our moderator today is Daniel Price, managing director of Rock Creek Global Advisors. He served in the George W. Bush administration as assistant to the president for international economic affairs, where he had more than a little bit of experience with organizing successful G8 summits, I guess, at that time. And before that, he was a partner in the Sidley Austin law firm. So I'm going to turn it over to Dan now, and thank you very much for everyone for coming.
Hey, thank you, Mike. Dan?
Mike, thank you very much. Ken, thank you very much for having us. Ambassador Pierce, Ambassador Lambrinidis, a pleasure to see you both. And first order of business, congratulations to both of you. Ambassador Pierce, to your government for hosting a very successful G7 summit. Congratulations to the Prime Minister, of course, but also those in the Cabinet Office and the entire government who worked so hard to make it a success. Likewise, Ambassador Lambrinidis, congratulations to you. Congratulations to the President of the Commission and the Council for organizing and executing another very good and consequential summit. Let me say, I think from a US perspective, these summits were to show that leading democracies working together can in fact meet key global challenges, whether that's COVID-19, climate change, and increasingly assertive China, to work together to repair the global trading system, and also to meet future challenges: pandemic preparedness, supply chain resilience, digital governance, and technology regulation. If I'm right that these were the goals, let me ask each of you how you think the respective summits measured up. Ambassador Pierce, over to you first.
Well, thanks very much, Dan, and thank you very much to WITA for having me. And it's great to be here with Stavros. Stavros and I have known each other for a long time, and we frequently find ourselves making the case for free trade. So it's great to be able to do that again. Thank you for your kind words about the G7 summit. Why don't I cover G7 and NATO? I think you're absolutely spot on. They were good at showing united purpose among the world's major industrialized nations. Very important to stress that bit, because of course you have the G20, which is a different group and obviously a bigger group. But the point about the G7 is its ability to move the financial and economic dial. And in that respect, they were able to address the biggest issue of our time, which is the pandemic and vaccines, and how to get economies back on track. And they were able to say some important things about climate and the commitment to take even greater action for COP26 in November. So those are absolutely the sorts of issues the G7 was originally set up to address, as well as keeping the world economy stable. So I think it's very good that we've had that. We were also able to agree with President Biden about an initiative to help developing countries with things like infrastructure as an alternative offer to being sucked into the Chinese Belt and Road initiative, with all the downsides that has for individual countries' indebtedness. So I think that was also, going to your point about key 21st century challenges, we wanted to show that open societies really have something to offer, and we think we succeeded in that. And just in a bilateral connection, the President and Prime Minister put forward a new Atlantic Charter 80 years after the Roosevelt-Churchill original, precisely to emphasize this point about open societies and what they can do and how people thrive within them. Turning to the NATO summit, NATO too must adapt to meet the new challenges of the 21st century. Some of that is about weaponry and modernization. Some of it is about NATO tasking and the scope of its operations. Some of it is internal. And again, all the members came together and were able to agree a very good package for going forward. So I think it showed that internationalism is back. It showed open societies at work. It answered that question of the Russians and the Chinese, it's the end of the West. Well, no, it isn't. We've just set the trend on economies and security in a very important way.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Karen. I'll come back to China a little bit later. But first, Stavros, could I get your top line on the EU-US summit and whether that delivered as you had expected and hoped?
Yes, thanks, Dan. And it's great to be with Karen, indeed. I would say my top line is that the two biggest economies in the world, the biggest economic relationship, the two regions of the world that represent about 800 million people and are based on shared democratic values, are back in business together. And that's a very strong message. It's a message, first of all, to our own people. We decided in the summit to take a number of measures that will ensure that the prosperity and the security of our people is going to be enhanced after this summit and with what is coming up. It was not just grounding the Airbus-Boeing dispute and suspending the tariffs on both sides for 5 years, but it was also setting the rules of the road for the economy of the 21st century, especially the digital economy, with the Trade and Technology Council put in place, and all these measures that are intended to increase dramatically the investment and trade between the EU and the US. We also had a big success in discussing providing security for our people, and the establishment of for the first time, of an EU-US dedicated defense dialogue is a recognition of the fact that the EU itself is becoming now much stronger in terms of producing together, deploying together around the world, becoming a true security provider to its neighborhood and further out, and the importance of working together to face joint challenges, always under the umbrella, of course, of NATO. Under that, I should say, under that umbrella, you should also put the fact that the sanctions coordination is becoming much stronger now between the EU and the US. Belarus sanctions 2 days ago were the latest example where EU, US, the UK, and Canada together announced sanctions against Belarus. We have been saying for many years that the effectiveness of our sanctions increases dramatically when we do them together, and then when we take into account each other's sensitivities in the process, so that those who get hit with the sanctions cannot divide and conquer us. And this is what we have done. And finally, Dan, I would say we've sent a very strong message, not just to our own people, but to the international community, that the Transatlantic Partnership is back. And that means, in my view, that open societies, again, can demonstrate that they're the best providers of free and fair global public goods. And this is a major challenge because there are other countries out there who are trying to pretend that they can take our place. They can't. So when you look at the biggest, perhaps, global public good right now, which is fighting COVID, preventing future pandemics, getting vaccines into people's arms around the world, ensuring production of vaccines, supply chains that work, we made major decisions, including setting up a COVID manufacturing and supply chain task force. Another major public good is climate change. And there you see again that the EU and the US agreed together to work not just by leading by example in going to 2050, given how big our economies are and how important it is for us to take the lead, but also to coordinate together in outreach and in increasing the level of ambition, let's say, of other countries, including China. And you'll see that unfolding much better. Third major public good, human rights and democracy. Human rights around the world was a major part of our discussion and our decisions, as you will see in the joint communication. And I would say, fourth major public good, the new technology, artificial intelligence. What are the standards? Who sets them? Where's the world going to go? We're seeing what China is doing. Well, we decided in our Trade and Technology Council that we'll work together to set those standards in the future. So open societies, free societies will do this, not authoritarian planners. And finally, Karen mentioned this. It cannot be understated. Connectivity. Being able to ensure that we can invest around the world and can support countries who need major investments in a way that is very different, very transparent, very climate respecting, very respecting of the debt needs and the debt difficulties of other countries, not putting them into traps, but instead releasing their human and their capital potential. That kind of discussion also took place and decisions were made. So I am very optimistic, Dan.
Great. Let me drill down with each of you on a few of those topics. And you both touched on a number of them. I want to talk about climate, supply chain resilience, technology and digital governance. Starting on climate, both statements pledge close cooperation on climate disclosure, taxonomy, transition. My question to each of you is, do you think we're really all on the same page on those three critical topics. Ambassador Pierce, to you first.
Thanks very much. I think we're more or less on the same page among the G7. There were differences of emphasis. You see it over oil and gas, coal. So I won't disguise that there are differences of emphasis. And there are differences of emphasis in where countries want to concentrate their national effort. We are particularly interested in jobs and growth arising from tackling climate change in a way that promotes jobs and growth. We're very interested in climate finance, not least because of its direct relevance to developing countries. Some other G7 members are very interested in the nature side of things. So, but taken as a whole, we cover all the major areas of Paris and all the main themes that are going to be at COP26 in Glasgow. And I do think the advantage of having the G7 do climate is that when you come to things like sustainable investment, auditing that is now going to, we want to have climate factors brought into the auditing process. We obviously want to develop ways of green financing. Precisely because it's the G7, we have an opportunity to move the dial on that. So I'm quite optimistic. I think there's more that can be done on pledges. There's more that can be done on making sure that we don't support with our development assistance coal-fired stations abroad, that we help developing countries find other solutions. There's more to be done on the funding for that, certainly, and there's more to be done on biodiversity. But I think it was a good start, and hopefully taking advantage of the Biden administration's real enthusiasm, we can really push forward throughout the rest of this year to November.
Thank you, Karen. Stavros, over to you. The EU has been fairly, shall we say, aggressive, or you might say out front, on issues of disclosure, taxonomy, transition, even showing that there are differences among member states. Where do you think we got to, both with the G7, but in particular in the US-EU summit on those three critical issues?
Well, first of all, speaking domestically about the EU, precisely because we are 27 member states, the fact that we had to discuss deeply among ourselves first before we reached the climate law that we just passed, with the concrete goal of 55% reductions by 2030, carbon neutrality by 2050, and many other provisions. That in many ways shows that we managed to get to what is actually very realistic, not just for us, but for others as well. We did find the denominator that worked. And that is because we do have very different economies. So an emphasis we place particularly, and we are discussing as well with the administration and the G7, of course, is just transition. This is a very, very important thing for us and a very important thing for the US as well. We are committed to making sure that people are not left behind in this. And frankly, there will be some people who are working today in coal, for example, as Karen mentioned, that already way before we even began discussing those things at the G7 or at the EU-US level, we're losing their jobs because coal simply is not competitive anymore. And there are other technologies that have reached economies of scale that are much cleaner. So just transition is big. The issue of taxonomy is big because it goes to sustainable finance. We have to be able to give both our companies a roadmap of how to consider, what a clean investment might be, but also to those who finance investments to know what kind of financing would be considered to be, clean financing. And there's some work to be done there. Auditing is very important, but it doesn't address really that part of the equation. So we focus on both auditing and that, and we think that's big. Like Karen, we do focus as well a lot on the issue of jobs and growth. We have, in fact, determined that this is the new growth strategy of Europe coming out of COVID. And, you know, in the Next Generation EU package, which is about $1 trillion that we now will be borrowing together as EU, not letting each member country try to go it alone, and supporting every member state. There, 37% of member state national plans have to focus on clean investments. So we're looking at deep transformation of our economies for the green future. And we are also funding massively research and development that needs to be done. So in the US context, Dan, very quickly, two things where I hope we can actually see more closely eye to eye. One has to do with what to do with carbon leakage. That's a very big thing, because as we transform our economies, the initial massive investments needed for that greening are very expensive, and it takes some time. You get to the point that you make trillions of dollars in profits, and you create massive jobs, but the takeoff is very sensitive. And there, we believe that we should not be allowing countries that have decided not to live up to their Paris commitments to be able to dump cheap, dirty products in our environments, and also to ensure that some of our companies don't decide to leak carbon the other way by leaving and going and doing investments elsewhere. This is fundamentally a policy for the middle class, for the average worker, ensuring that we can move to green transition while protecting. So it should be a point of conversion between us and the United States, and we are talking very much about that. And then, of course, the issue of nature itself is frankly a very, very big one. I mean, we're doing all this now in a way that we think will transform our economies and make us much stronger economically, much more prosperous than before. But it all begins because there is an existential threat out there that cannot be ignored, and that is that the climate is changing. So, we are taking that very seriously into account. We have committed to 30% protection of lands and waters immediately. We have committed, as Karen mentioned, to ensuring that unabated coal energy production will be not funded publicly by the end of 2021 even. So, we're putting our money and our political efforts where our mouths are. And I hope that we can inspire. You can tell us more about the US and the funding, Dan, because that's a big thing. Obviously, we are dedicating the UK and the EU a lot of money in this. But there's a lot of discussion now in the US about the infrastructure package, whether it passes, how it passes, what kind of investments it contains. And we follow this very closely because, of course, how much the US will be able to invest and then to generate private interest in investment in green may to some extent depend also on this discussion.
Absolutely, Stavros. No, I mean, you've hit on important topics, including the topic of carbon pricing and border adjustment that we'll need to come back to. I want to move on to a few other topics. Both the G7, through its establishment of a future tech forum, and the US-EU summit through the Trade and Technology Council, recognize the importance of greater cooperation on digital governance, standard setting, technology regulation. Karen, for you first, where do you see this going? Where do you see the Future Tech Forum going? And then Stavros, I will have the same question for you, but also the question of where are we going to get to on resolving Privacy Shield? Ambassador Pierce, you first.
Great, thanks very much. Just to say, we also agreed a bilateral tech agreement. So we've got this well covered between UK, US and EU. I think on the tech forum, this is fundamentally about pooling the talents, the innovative and scientific talents of G7 members, so that, as Stavros was saying, we make full use of the next generation of technology. We develop them in ways that benefit our citizens rather than are used to spy on them in the case of AI. And crucially, that the standards and norms that flow from that new technology and the developments reinforce open markets and reinforce transparency and are not dictated by authoritarian regimes, where they'll obviously be closed and over-regulated and run by governments. So that's a very important part. Whether or not digital services will in the end come under that tech forum, or whether or not they'll be left to individual trading agreements, I think is something that will need to be looked at. And oddly enough, I was on another trade panel this morning talking about how digital services might be covered either as freestanding trade agreements or as part of bigger ones. For the UK, the free trade agreement we're in the process of negotiating would have a very strong digital chapter. And this echoes the agreement we've just signed with Japan, where we have a really big and modern in a digital chapter that looks at things like banning unjustified data localization, avoiding unjustified restrictions on free flow of data, upholding world-leading standards of protection for individuals' data. So it can be done in one of two ways. But I think the tech forum itself is all about using this transformative technology in a way that really enhances global goods, as Stavros was saying. And, 5G, what comes after 5G, that is a critical part of this, because fundamentally that's what alerted everybody to the growing gap in the way we're approaching new technology.
Well, absolutely. And one of the benefits of close cooperation among the United States, the UK, and the EU, and the G7 and other democracies is the hope to avoid a repeat of 5G and what happened there. Stavros, prospects for cooperation between the US and EU on technology and data governance?
I have to say they're very strong, because the Trade and Technology Council has 10 different working groups on everything from coordinating on export controls and foreign direct investment, to looking at artificial intelligence and AI standards, to looking at trade and climate change and new green technologies there. So the whole of government approach will ensure that everyone who needs to be in the room or in the separate 10 different rooms will be there. I'm very optimistic. Look, we decided that we have to drive digital transformation that boosts innovation, and it's based on democratic values. It's as simple as that, and we will do it. We also decided to work on seeing how we can move towards aligning key policies on technology and standards, and creating in that way as well a boost for standard setting for virtually every corner of the world in which we have a reach. When it comes to, like I said, export controls or investment screenings, it's going to be supremely important to ensure that we can coordinate better on them, because these are issues that have to do with also with countries that are trying to and have in the past used our technological breakthroughs. In the other day, Dan, I think what we decided, without saying it in practice, is that we have to run faster than China and other countries, and we have to protect the runners once they are there. It's not just simply sitting back and saying, oh my God, look at what this person is doing and that person is doing, and how they are massively subsidizing this, that, the other. Of course, we're doing this. And in the context of protecting runners, we certainly will work together at WTO level to ensure that we have new rules, of the game when it comes to massive state subsidies or unfair competition by state subsidized enterprises. But it's also about running faster ourselves and investing better in our own economies. And this is what we are going to be doing. So I am quite optimistic.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you. Ambassador Pierce, I know you have to leave shortly, but let me just pose this question to you. In the G7 declaration of some 70 paragraphs, China was mentioned only 3 times, but it was the animating spirit of many more paragraphs than those 3. How far do you think we're going to get on cooperation on export controls, coordinating national security reviews, coming to grips with supply chain issues having to do with critical materials on which there is a heavy dependence now, at least on the processing, on China. How much progress have we made, and what's the future look like?
I think the summit took a conscious decision. Certainly Boris Johnson took a conscious decision that the summit would be what we were for, not what we were against. And that there was a very good discussion on China, also one on Russia. But the whole point was to set out a positive agenda. And as we were saying earlier, I think it did a good job in that respect. You know, it showed that internationalism, multilateralism is back and can make a difference. But I think what has happened this year, well, last year actually, with the pandemic and the Chinese initial response to the pandemic, what has been happening on 5G and elsewhere, what's been happening with Belt and Road, it has opened countries' eyes a bit, I think, to the risk that we fall behind. And if you think that since the Second World War, this is fundamentally, security and prosperity have fundamentally been dominated by America and open and transparent ways of doing business. And most of, not all, but most of the great technological developments have come out of the West. And then we take a look at what's been happening in the last couple of years, and something seems to click in everyone's minds that we are at grave risk of falling behind. And therefore, that's why you see this sense coming through in all the elements of the G7 communique. And on top of that, we want to build back better and fairer as a result of the pandemic to get global recovery going, but also to answer those critics who say that the ordinary citizen is not really seeing the benefits of some of the things that governments do and on the overseas stage. So I think all of that is really important. It's not to obscure the fact that China is a strategic competitor, nor that the rise of China is a very serious geostrategic development. It's one reason why we, the Brits, are putting more focus on the Indo-Pacific. For example. As to whether or not we'll be successful, I think you have to start somewhere. A lot of successful cooperation is getting the organizational stuff right, so that people meet in the right format, in the right sequence, at the right time, and the right people are in the room. And that's always a very boring bit to talk about for international audiences. But it is actually critical to being able to get sensible decisions. So we will work on all of those things. I think one thing I did want to say about 5G, which I think is important in this context, 5G was fundamentally a market failure by the West. I think it also opened our eyes to the fact that there are some aspects of the new technologies that can't be left to the markets. Because there's no incentive for the markets to fill the gap, or because they're too efficient and they don't see a need to fill a gap. In fact, they probably don't even see a gap. So we want to look at coordination on that and to work out what is the right level of government intervention. To help with all of these questions, we set up an economic resilience panel as part of the G7. And that panel has done a report and will be continuing its work throughout the British presidency. It will look particularly at the supply chain question and where the right balance should properly be drawn, so you get diversified supply chains that contribute to global free trade, but do not end up with a critical national shortage when there's an emergency. And as we all know, that's a complicated question, but it is one capable of being answered. So the panel, which has representatives right across the G7, will be looking in detail at that.
I'm very glad you mentioned that. I mean, Mark Sedwell led a wonderful process, and that panel report is excellent. And to those in the audience who have not seen that panel report, you can find it on the UK website, and I commend it to your attention.
Thanks very much.
Ambassador, I understand you have to leave us now.
I'm very sorry about that. I had a pre-existing commitment on the Hill, but thank you for having me, and thanks for being such a supporter of free trade.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, Stavros. Bye, everybody.
Stavros, over to you. You had offered some comments on technology and China already. Let me shift the discussion to trade. Unfortunately, Ambassador Pierce isn't here to comment on this, but the UK is moving forward with bilaterals, has expressed interest in joining CPTPP. The EU is moving forward with Indonesia and still has robust ambitions for WTO reform. Where do you see the US on trade policy? I mean, you're obviously not waiting around, and neither is the UK for the United States. Is it clear to you yet what US trade policy and ambitions are? You're on mute, Stavros.
Yeah. So okay. So it's a great question, Dan. I would be a little cautious not to speculate on your trade policy more broadly, but I have to say that in the case of the US-EU cooperation, what I'm seeing is a greater readiness to try to get irritants resolved, although not necessarily an immediate set of proposals to achieve that. But when it comes to Airbus and Boeing, for example, whereas before the emphasis was on tariffs, on which, of course, then we had to retaliate ourselves. Getting the two biggest open economies in the world give the impression that we are good at fighting with each other and making headlines, but not working with each other and making history. Now we are working with each other, and we could make history because coming out of COVID and with the biggest, most hard-hit industry in the world, which is the airline industry, being able to get such a strong signal of freezing those tariffs and working together, to cooperate as opposed to litigate, that would be a huge economic boost, not just for the industry itself, but frankly for also the thousands of companies who supply it. So there, I see a desire and a readiness to engage. I also see a much greater desire to engage in the multilateral field, and our agreement to work together on WTO reform, I think, is an indication of a U.S. administration that understands that if you leave the table, others will try to take your seat, and this is what had been happening for the past few years in many international organizations, including the WHO, WTO. The EU was, holding the fort quite effectively, but not as effectively, not even close to as effectively as we can do now together. And that requires a lot of alliance building as well. And we understand this. When we talk about AI standards, I mean, of course, we'll be talking about them. And of course, we will be determining them. And of course, it will have to be based on, fundamental human rights and human dignity. At the same time, to really truly be effective, we need to build coalitions around the world with countries. You know who the major human rights violators are, the ones who are committed to human rights violations because of political beliefs or because of authoritarian tendencies. You know who the few countries who are truly committed to democracy and human rights are, even if they're not perfect all the time. And you forget many times that in the middle sit, more than 100 countries that are sitting on the fence. But you must be able to lure them to fall at the right side of the fence, as opposed to the wrong side of the fence. And with those, you need some very serious discussions about, how artificial intelligence can be misused. What the best way to ensure the human dignity of their people would be, and we are determined to engage in that. So now, when it comes to trade deals more broadly.
Stavros, let me stick with the irritants, because I've heard from a number of sources that there's nice language in the US-EU Summit Declaration, but basically whether it's Airbus, Boeing, or 232 tariffs, or Privacy Shield and cross-border data flows. It just kicked the can down the road. Was any real progress made other than weapons down on Airbus Boeing, for example, or on 232?
Yeah, I mean, weapons down, you know, you know, if your experience, what a huge first move that is, if you're going to be getting to any resolution. So I think that's a really big success. When it comes to Airbus Boeing, there were some principles set. When it comes to the necessary transparency and appropriateness of research development or other support that companies get, that would mostly apply to, of course, Boeing. Or when it comes to financing companies, with market terms, that would apply mostly to Airbus. When you look at the decisions of the WTO at any rate, we have the principles in place, and that's very important. And we're going to use the next 5 years to ensure that we actually apply them now in practice. And I am supremely hopeful, frankly, that as we moved from litigation to cooperation, we didn't kick anything down the road. We are basically moving towards a firm resolution of a real issue. And the real issue is that, both Boeing and Airbus will have to be transitioning themselves massively towards different kinds of aircraft, including cleaner aircraft. They both know this. This requires a tremendous amount of investment in research and development, and frankly, also an ability to be supported in the initial stages when they do so. But we have determined that that kind of thing is okay, so long as it doesn't hurt each other, and so long as we have a level playing field. And we've also determined that there are other countries like China, but not only China, that are producing 100% subsidized wide-body aircraft as we are fighting, and that's not okay. And so in our Airbus agreement, we also agreed, as you know, explicitly to work together on addressing the threats to the market coming from non-market economies. Now, 232 is more complex. There are many elements involved in it. The overcapacity from China, of course, is the biggest one, and the EU has always said that this is the real issue. Terming the EU a national security threat is, makes absolutely no sense. It didn't from the get-go, and imposing tariffs that are illegal, in our view, under WTO and international rules, it doesn't make legal sense. But at the same time, there's a real issue for our industries, EU and US ones, and that is overcapacity. And that's fundamentally Chinese overcapacity. So what we decided is that we're going to be discussing that issue. There are political considerations to be taken into account on this very sensitive sector in the US as well. So this may explain also part of the delay in this process. But what we did is we took a very, very positive step as European Union. We could have increased our own countermeasures against the 232 tariffs in June, and we didn't. We announced that for 6 months until the end of the year, we would not raise our own tariffs, as we have the right to do. And we give the breathing space for these negotiations to move on. So we have now about 5.5 months. That's plenty of time to resolve this. And resolve it means dealing with the Chinese overcapacity issue together as allies, not as national security threats of each other. And getting rid of those tariffs.
Stavros, great. Stavros, thank you very much for that optimistic read.
No, but Dan, why don't you just go ahead and just rain on my parade here? Go ahead.
No. It's a very optimistic read, and I hope you are right. We shall see. We shall see. Back to Ken and Mike for audience questions.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Stavros. Really lively conversation. Appreciate, obviously, Ambassador Pierce as well. Mike, do you want to kick things off? A couple questions from your quiver.
Yeah, I do have, and thank you very much for the very interesting discussion. And but I want to talk about resolving disputes, sort of the process. So one, there was some general discussion about WTO reform, but I don't recall seeing anything about dealing with the appellate body and getting the dispute settlement process going. I know that's not just a G7 issue, but it certainly involves the US and the EU as leading voices in the WTO system. Any progress on that?
I think there's, we agree on some things immediately on the WTO. We have to conclude, let's say, a meaningful agreement on fisheries subsidies, for example. I'm not saying this is a low-hanging fruit, but this is something that is supremely important, and we can move on it. We have agreed to use trade as a policy response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and to also work through a WTO to facilitate the expansion of production and equitable access to vaccines. Now, we have not agreed on the precise correct method to do so, but the EU has submitted a very concrete proposal on what that would mean, with the emphasis on increasing manufacturing capacity in third countries. We have already dedicated €1 billion to doing so in Africa, for example, avoiding unnecessary export restrictions, ensuring the functioning of supply chains, et cetera, et cetera. We've also agreed, and we have been working for a while on this, including with Japan, in a trilateral context, that we have to deal with the rules of the WTO when it comes to, protecting intellectual property rights, forced technology transfers, and industrial subsidies, massive illegal industrial subsidies. So this is something that we totally agree on. The appellate body is something that we feel very strongly about from the beginning, and we think that it is very important for the US and the EU to work both on the negotiating function of WTO and strengthen it, including eventually, if it doesn't work, promoting plurilateral agreements, if that is a way to promote international trade, but also work with the dispute settlement system, because frankly, what we saw with the U.S. by in a sense refusing to appoint judges to the settlement system is that you had a referee, and you need a referee in the system. Otherwise, there are too many big bad bullies out there who can try to play their own trade games around the world, and not just us anymore. So you need a referee, and but we didn't. Some rules we didn't like, and then we just killed the referee. And that's not the way to go. So it's very important for us to get back, but we do understand U.S. concerns, and we're ready to work very hard to look at the WTO rule book, therefore more effectively. So I'd say that is my general answer. WTO can do so much with the pandemic as well. I mean, there's a health initiative in WTO that we are supporting as EU, trying to see how it is that we can look at pharmaceuticals, protective equipment, other things that are very important in these cases, and ensuring that we can allow their export and their import, free of, major tariffs and stuff like that. I mean, we've seen issues with different countries around the world around this. So a lot of good work to be done. I am pleased, very pleased that the US is back on the WTO discussion right now. I'm not going to tell you that we have resolved everything. I think there are quite a number of issues that we still need to agree on. But we are discussing, and therefore, yes, again, I am hopeful, Dan. I am hopeful.
I think that's we're all about hopeful here at WIDA as well, and looking at trying to find the positive stories we can tell. Ambassador, we had several of the questions that have come in from the audience relate to, you've talked about Boeing Airbus a bit, the 232 tariffs that are still in place and were not taken down here. Is there maybe some space for the U.S. and EU to find areas where they can work together to build on this cooperative relationship that comes out of the summit, for example, on the China issues at the WTO? And is that an area where we can the two big economies, the U.S. and the EU, can work together, maybe build address some of those other issues within those contexts, and be able to hopefully maybe even back into some progress on the 232 issues by working together on things like the China issues?
Well, yes, I mean, of course. And although we also have not mentioned China in our joint communication extensively at all, A lot of the work that we're doing and a lot of what we've discussed up to now relates to China's trade and economic practices around the world, relates to China's economy in China itself and the problems faced there, and relates also to China's values and governance models and what they export around the world. In addition to the goods that they export, they also try to export those values more. So all that is in there. The Trade and Technology Council has many areas that do relate to China and to others, but is a very positive economic agenda fundamentally. So for those who are, inevitably, I've had to answer many questions about the irritants. And the fact is that, we grounded Airbus Boeing, which is a hugely important thing. And we are working hard on 232, which is also hugely important to so many of our industries and our consumers on both sides of the Atlantic. So I understand I have to do that discussion, but the positive agenda out of the Trade and Technology Council cannot be underestimated. We have decided that the rules of the game for the 21st century economy have to be set. They're not set yet, and that the two biggest open economies in the world now will do it together. We have decided that when it comes to new technologies that encase in them both technological challenges and standards challenges, therefore economic challenges in the end of the day, and values challenges, that for those we will work together. We will not be moving it alone. And whether it is, when it comes to regulation, or whether it is when it comes to, you take the clean, the clean energy and the environment. Technologies are being developed as we speak. Technologies of scale in the past only 10, 15 years have skyrocketed. It's unbelievable how fast it's gone. The economic growth that has been proven to come out of those technologies, at least in Europe, is documented. Since 1990, we reduced our carbon emissions by more than 24%, and we have increased our GDP by more than 65%. And that's even way before you had the economies of scale. So we know that going green and investing massively in these new technologies is going to open up opportunities for our economies, not just domestically, but also internationally. And, supporting other countries around the world to go green, also by committing, as we in the EU are determined to ensure that happens, that developed countries are able to contribute 100 billion a year until 2025 to help the transition of others. That also ensures that as they transition, as every country finds its own path to transitioning, they can always have a partner in the EU or the US to be able to work with them, provide the technologies of the future in a way that allows for this transition to be fair to all their citizens and to be transparent and to not debt trap them and all these things. So, these are amazing opportunities for a positive agenda. It is not a small thing. It is the economy of the future, and we are sitting at the same side of the table on it now together.
So thank you. And we only got you for 5 more minutes. I've got 4 topics in the Q&A. I'm going to just drop them all for you, lightning rounds on each one. The first one had to do, it connects 2 of the questions having to do with the U.S.-China Comprehensive Agreement that was reached. And there's been some discussions of the Xinjiang cotton issue and goods produced under slave labor. So maybe we can just talk about that issue for the EU. Carbon border adjustment issues that have come up or maybe coming up in the future, and how you see that maybe playing out. And the last one, the EU has opened up significant travel for the United States for Americans to travel to the EU, but a lot more restrictions on EU citizens traveling right now to the United States. That's also a trade restriction right now for EU companies. Any thoughts on those final issues before we wrap this up?
All right, brilliant, thanks. So the comprehensive issue of investment is going as we speak through the normal legal scrubbing and translations in Europe. That takes time. It was expected to take until the end of the year, more or less, and it would require ratification, including from the European Parliament. And it goes without saying that China's unwise decision to sanction members of the European Parliament and other Europeans in response to our entirely understandable and justifiable sanctions for what's happening in Xinjiang is not helping this process for China as well. But the agreement itself was a small and important step, not to solve everything with China. You can't do this, in one fell swoop, but to ensure that when it comes to investments, there would be fair market access that today doesn't exist, including for services. And that market access that we achieved would be on an MFN basis, which means that US companies and others would also benefit immediately from it. That there would be much more transparency and EU participation, company participation in a different standard setting in the Chinese context, but also on what subsidized companies do and how they compete with the EU. And also, for the third time, there would be sustainable development provisions, including the obligation to respect the Paris Agreement and the obligation to move towards ratifying ILO and labor rights. And that's part of, let's say, then moving to your second question, labor rights. You will see in the summit joint statement, the EU-US, repeated references to labor rights and our decision to work together on them around the world. So you will see quite a bit of that unfolding, especially in cases in which we are both together with GSP, other kinds of agreements in particular countries around the world. I spoke earlier about the carbon border adjustment, so I don't want to expand too much again on it. As I said, it is fundamentally important to avoid carbon leakage as we are transforming our economies. In our view, it's important to do it together. This is a shield for the middle class and for workers, but also businesses, but certainly for workers in our countries. And it's also, frankly, in and of itself, a huge incentive for other countries. The mere hanging of that Damocles sword for other countries to move towards green transition goals, which is really the ultimate desire here. It's not to impose CBAM, it's not to have to impose CBAM, because other countries are doing, as we are doing, a true, honest to God green transition. Finally, on the travel, yes, we are discussing this right now with the U.S. administration, and we very much hope and expect that very soon the U.S. will reciprocate. The reality is that from day one, when we imposed travel restrictions because of COVID in 2020, we blocked every country around the world. And then we started creating very narrow exceptions based on strict scientific data. As we did so, we allowed, however, every American who was working in Europe, had a valid work visa in Europe, to be able to travel back and forth so that EU-US trade investment, as you said, would continue. Now, the US, on the other hand, when it imposed initially its restrictions, it imposed them on a select number of countries, including the whole European Schengen area. But more than 100 countries were never, restricted from traveling. And today we're in a situation where, in fact, the EU and the US are the two regions of the world that are the most massively vaccinated ones, and the ones in which cases are going down more dramatically. So we are, in fact, allowing people, especially Europeans who are in this country, who haven't seen their families for a year and a half, because they can travel to Europe as Europeans, but then they're not allowed back to the States, even if they're vaccinated or even if they test negative, and not even with a condition of quarantine, they're willing to take it. That has to end. It has to end. We also have to be able to kickstart our economies again together. And look, the biggest investors in each other's prosperity are Americans investing in Europe and Europeans investing in America. It is simple. About 60% of all foreign investment in America comes from European companies. And the executives of those companies want to be able to travel to the US in order to oversee those investments, in order to expand them in many cases. And today they can't. It's a mistake. And that kind of trade and investment relationship is what our people expect to show, indeed, that our democracies, our economies are delivering to working families, are delivering to industry, and are delivering to consumers. And we have been showing that we can be each other's strongest ally in this for decades. And today, with our economies coming out of COVID even stronger than before, I believe, we will be bringing even more optimism to our people. So we have to open up safely, I emphasize, safely. So it's not, let's just open up and kumbaya the whole thing, because no one wants that, right? So safely, use scientific evidence. We have determined in Europe, and we announced it last week. I mean, 3 weeks ago, we determined that everyone who is vaccinated with vaccines that are approved can travel now to the European Union from anywhere in the world, which means about 60% of Americans today who are vaccinated, if not more, already. And last week, we decided, again, with scientific criteria, number of vaccinations, whatever, we're going to put America, the United States, in our safe list of those countries where even if you're not vaccinated, even if you're not an essential traveler, you can still come to the EU, but according to requirements such as testing, quarantining, et cetera, determined by each member state. So we are safely, scientifically opening up. And we hope, I really do hope that the discussions we're having today with the White House, with the US administration more broadly, will come to a fruitful conclusion very, very soon. It's going to be good for our people, good for our economies. Nothing more hopeful to give after a year and a half of this tragic change in our lives than Americans and Europeans shaking hands again, frankly, families meeting. I'm Greek, hugging. Apologies to those who don't do that much. But, nothing more hopeful than this. And we'll be working day and night on this, and I hope that we'll be successful as well.
Thank you. Big hugs for all of you. Dan, any final words before we wrap up?
Just a big thank you to Stavros for not only an informative, optimistic, spirited, and really encouraging set of remarks.
Thank you. Mike, any final words?
No, just a thank you as well.
Thanks. Stavros, thank you so much. You've been very generous with your time today and in the past with WIDA. We really appreciate it. I know I look forward to hosting you in person when it's safe to do so. I think we're very close to that time, I hope.
Absolutely. But you have to practice, I have to say, Ken, you have to practice your hugging and kissing. And if you get the right point, then just give me a call. Mike,
you can hug me anytime.
I know you haven't invited me, but if you do the same.
We will do so, and I will be the first to hug you. So
that's brilliant. And let me just say, it's always such a pleasure to be with Dan. I mean, Dan is an eminence grise in these issues, as someone who has been fighting for open trade all his life, but not just fighting for it, succeeding in it, and inspiring others in this process. So thank you to WIDA, thank you to Dan. Nelson, I understand, was on the call as well.
Yeah.
Thank you to Nelson as well for all his support over the years.
Nelson is fantastic. We're big fans of Nelson at WIDA as well. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador Dan, Mike, Ambassador Pierce and her team, and your team, Stavros, for your team's help. Really terrific to work with. Really grateful to everybody who's watching. Thank you for joining us. Reminder too, if you're eligible and it's available, get the shot wherever you are watching today's event. Thank you all for being with us. We hope to host you again soon.